well, thank you all so much for joining us for Notre-Dame, a rising from the ashes. Millions around the world gasped as the fire on April 15th, 2019, engulfed the roof and spire of the Cathedral of Notre-Dame in Paris. During this presentation, we will follow the history of this hallowed ground from the first shrines and temples of ancient times to the first cathedral on the site in the 6th century to the Notre-Dame we know as a masterpiece of French Gothic architecture, built between the 12th and 14th centuries. And now, almost 4 years later, we will follow the developments as restoration efforts continue around the clock. And so this program is led by art historian Mary Woodward, who serves as a guide at several historic New England properties. She previously served as the public programs coordinator and educator for the Concord Museum. Mary has a BA in art history from Furman University and an MA in art history from Emory University. She has over 40 years of experience in museums of all shapes and sizes, from the comprehensive collection at the Cleveland Museum of Art to the one-room log cabin birthplace of President James Polk. We again thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Tewksbury Cultural Council for sponsoring. So all 162 of us who are watching live, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mary for joining us this morning. And Mary, you can take it away. Thanks so
much. Robert, thank you very much. And I want to extend my thanks to the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Cultural Center there as well, as always, for supporting my program. So thank you so much. If you're watching me from a snowy part of the United States, I'm so sorry, and I hope you can dig out soon. Maybe that'll be the last of it. Let's get started. Here we go. Notre-Dame's history is one of construction and destruction, restoration and renewal. Its detailed architecture is as complex as its storied past. We are going to start by looking at the history of the Ile de la Cité, the island in the Seine River, where people have lived and worshipped for many thousands of years. It doesn't look like this anymore, I'll tell you, you know that. Recent archaeological digs have uncovered evidence of Mesolithic people living, hunting, and gathering along the Seine as much as 11,000 years ago. These Celtic people were using bows and arrows, stone flints, and dugout canoes, like this recreated site in Ireland. Gradually, they began to settle and developed farming and industry. And by the 2nd century BC, we have a name for the people living here, the Parisi. They were Celtic seamen or boatmen who took advantage of their ideal location of their settlement to control trade on the river and the roads that crossed the river there. The island is about 42 acres now, but in ancient times it was half that size, and it's always been higher on the eastern end. Julius Caesar confirms that the Parisi built their town on an island in the river. In 52 BC, Caesar conquered the Parisi and made Gaul part of the Roman Empire. The Romans called it Lutetia Parisorum, or the place near the swamp of the tribe of the Parisi. Perhaps 8,000 people or so were living there at the time. The Romans they set about imposing their road system and their lifestyle on the Parisi. The Cardo, the main north-south axis of the town, can be followed today if you're in Paris and you walk along the Rue Saint-Jacques on the left bank. The Romans built an theater, an aqueduct, both of which remain, some pieces of it remain to be seen, a forum, an arena, houses, an imperial palace, and bath complexes. The island was swampy, low to the ground, low to the water surface, and prone to flooding. On the west side of the Ile de la Cité, the island, which is the right side of it on this drawing, was the government center. The government complex buildings were put there. If you know Paris, it's pretty much where Sainte-Chapelle is now, and where there are still government buildings, I should add. But more importantly for our topic, Julius Caesar had a temple built to Jupiter, built on the eastern end of the island. And I've put an arrow there over on the left on the higher end, and that's the site of future Notre-Dame. Also there on the eastern end, the remains of a Roman building. Was it a basilica? You see it drawn in this picture here. Those remains were found in the 18th century, unearthed under the surface in front of Notre-Dame, but it was impossible to unearth the whole structure. While they were digging up the floor in the middle of Notre-Dame in 1711 to put in a sepulcher, they found a collection of monumental carved stone blocks. They were probably meant to go together, and so named. They are called the Pillar of the Nautes. The pillar is part of a stone shrine, they think, that was built by the locals, by the Parisis. The Nautes were the rich capitalists, the busy shippers, who were the wealthiest people in the town of the Parisi. In total, and you can see a possible reconstruction of it there, the pillar may have been 20 feet tall. The Latin inscription on it says very clearly, in the reign of Tiberius Caesar Augustus, the Nautes of the Parisi raised this monument to very great and very good Jupiter at their own expense. So that helps us date it between the years 14 and 37 AD. And you saw in the picture before where it was located on the eastern end of the island. The largest stone in this pillar is about 4 feet tall, and it has Jupiter and Vulcan on two sides, but on the remaining sides, it features Gallic gods of the Parisi. There's Isis, and you see him displayed here. He's kind of the strongman god. He was sort of their version of Hercules. He was the divinity that the workers and the sailors were most attracted to. Then there's a completely unclear understanding with this Taurus trigeneris. It's a bull image with 3 bird cranes with it. And clearly a fearsome face there, and the Celtic being called Cernunnos. It's kind of an animal man with ringed horns on his head. So the meaning of some of those are unclear. Some of them are familiar to scholars. And the fact that you had gods and goddesses of both the Romans as well as the Gauls, or the Parisi, is evidence perhaps of a happy coexistence and a mixture of beliefs in Lutetia as early as the 1st century AD. Now, in the 2nd century, the church in Rome sent bishops into the area of France to spread Christianity. And the one that went the furthest from Rome was Denis, who became the first bishop of Paris. We believe he arrived in Paris in about the year 240, but was martyred for his beliefs about 10 years later. Yes, he did have his head chopped off. It took 2 blows, apparently. And the legend is that as soon as his head touched the ground, his body picked it up, and his body marched away with his head in his hands and walked for about 5 or 6 miles north of Paris until it came to the village of what was called Catulacum then, where he's buried. And that's now the suburb of Saint-Denis. And we will talk about Saint-Denis, not so much the saint, but the building that was inspired by him, the church, as we go forward. Any remains that there may have been of a 4th century Christian church on the island, or 3rd or 4th century, have been buried under the existing Notre-Dame, with no indication of them, but the clear supposition that there was a church there at one point. And the next people living on the island were the Merovingians. They were the Franks, who had originally come from Germany. Everybody was fleeing westward. They were fleeing the Huns, right, in the 400s and 500s. And so the Franks moved into the capital area, and their leader Clovis became a Christian. He made Paris his capital, and Clovis settled himself and his followers into the old Roman emperor's palace there on the west side of the island in the government buildings. It's likely that the very first cathedral on or the larger, sort of very first larger cathedral on the island was built by the Merovingians as part of their taking on and acquiring of the Christian faith. They built a number of churches in Paris, and so it's likely that they built one there, or perhaps they did what the Merovingians did in the town of Metz, France. In the town of Metz, the newly Christianized Merovingians there took an old Roman gymnasium and they readapted it for their church. So it may have been that the Merovingians in Paris did the same. Maybe they took that old Roman basilica and they turned it into their church. But we do know that they had a church there, and it was dedicated not to the Virgin Mary yet, but to Saint Stephen, the patron saint of Paris, before the Virgin Mary came along. The foundations in Paris on the island of that 6th century Merovingian cathedral have been discovered, again, in the area in front of Notre-Dame, but again, not a wholesale archaeological dig. But now, for the first time in our little run of history, now by the end of the 500s, we can talk about there being another church on the island. Probably started as a small chapel. So the Merovingians built their big one, St. Stephen. But by the end of the 500s, we know there was a small chapel on the island, and for the first time dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It was probably over by the bishop's palace. I know that I don't have a picture of that for you, but it was probably just a very small private chapel. But nevertheless, as the Virgin's popularity grew, that tiny chapel grew, so that in the 700s and 800s, it got to be bigger and bigger. Now, unfortunately for the history of Paris in the 800s, that meant the arrival of the Vikings. They attacked Paris repeatedly in the 800s. Sometimes they got paid off to go away, but you know, that never really works for long, does it? So in 856, the Vikings were back with at the wall of Paris, and you can see an artist's imagination of what the Ile de la Cité would look like back then. That's a bridge going over to the left bank, if you're familiar with Paris. So in 856, the Vikings were back, and they had a, their terms, they wanted Paris to surrender, and their terms were very, very harsh. They told the Parisians they could save 3 churches and no more. And for that price, they would have to pay heavily in gold and silver. So the Parisians had a choice, and they chose to save the big Merovingian church of St. Stephen. They chose to save the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, north of the city, and they chose to save one that was on the left bank that some of you may have visited, the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which was a church that they had founded in the 500s. So everything else, including the growing little Notre-Dame, everything else on the Ile de la Cité, the bishop's palace, the courts, the royal palace, everything else was looted and destroyed. I think one author suggested the Parisians felt a little bad about sort of sacrificing the Notre-Dame to that. So after the Vikings left, they began to rebuild a church and make it bigger and better for Notre-Dame. The Notre-Dame that we see today wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for a man named Maurice de Sully. He was born of humble parentage, and he rose to become the Bishop of Paris. And he was really the driving force behind the creation of Notre-Dame. He was born in the town of Sully, about a village about 100 miles south of Paris. But in the mid-12th century, all roads led to Paris. The new French king was the same age as Maurice. The king was known as Louis VII. And he took the throne in 1137. And that's about the same year we think that Maurice made it to Paris as a student in one of the universities. You know, Paris had had universities for ages, and students came from many countries, and they spoke the easiest communal language they could, which was Latin. And that's why that area of the left bank is still called the Latin Quarter. Maurice was a gifted student, and he quickly rose through church positions until by 1160, he was the Bishop of Paris. And he decided that his life's work, which for him would be 36 more years of life, would be the building of a new Notre-Dame cathedral. And he needed to, because the old wood-roofed Carolingian Cathedral of Notre-Dame, which this is probably a representation of here, the bigger building there, was already 300 years old when he came to the position of bishop. It was the one they built after the Viking raids. And so it was much too small for the crowds that would come to Notre-Dame on feast day. Maurice wasn't alone with this idea of building big churches, though. He was inspired by what his colleague, Abbot Suger, was doing at the Abbey of Saint Denis, just a few miles away. Suger had gotten an early start. He got the jump on the game. In other words, starting in 1130, Abbot Suger was building in a new Gothic style. And frankly, it made everything else around it look old, stumpy, and ugly. The revolution was this: they were using pointed arches throughout the construction. And this led to these beautiful light-filled interiors, soaring high ceilings, and colored light everywhere. And I just should say, as a tiny little footnote in here, the previous centuries, the Romanesque architects, they knew and used pointed arches sometimes, but the difference with Abbot Suger in 1130 is his master mason used them everywhere to their greatest advantage. So that was the difference, really. And it kicked off a building frenzy. One author said, so the Cathedral of Paris, meaning Notre Dame, entered the medieval race for beauty at a moment when the competition was its most intense. So Maurice, the Bishop of Paris, broke ground on the new Gothic Cathedral of Notre-Dame in 1163, on top of layers of French history: the shrines of the Parisi, the Roman temple to Jupiter, the Merovingian Basilica, which might have been the repurposed Roman one, and the Carolingian Church. Notre-Dame has a floor surface of more than 65,000 feet, and you're looking at Notre Dame right now. The cathedral can comfortably take in 9,000 worshipers, and it can push to 12 to 13,000 for special events. It was nearly the size of the next three oldest churches in Paris added together. Let's look at the plan for Maurice's church. It's a horseshoe shape, but closely, if you can see, it's still a cruciform church. Coming in with the nave, that's the section on the left from the doorway, which is in light blue over there to the far left. The transepts, which is the crossing, and the choir, which we refer to as all of the area, the curved area, which contains the apse and the altar, the choir. There's great unity and balance, as you can see in this plan. From the beginning, there were double side aisles on either side of the main nave, and they lead to a double ambulatory. That's the rounded apse there. It's a double pathway around the back of the altar so that pilgrims could come in and view the relics and keep moving. It was built to handle crowds. One of the challenges brought by the size of Notre Dame was that the curving rows of ceiling vaults were a challenge. The master mason solved the engineering problem with the addition of another pillar in the middle of several of the bays. Those are the red dots. In other words, the red dot wouldn't have been there before, but now it's so big, they have to put a pillar there. The master mason also made the crucial discovery that you could vault a ceiling just as easily with a V-shaped arch as you could with an X shape. These were fundamentally radical changes that were happening and making Gothic architecture possible. Just 19 years later, after breaking ground, the main ceiling vaults were finished, and the choir and the apse, everything to the east of the transept, the big sideways doors, was ready for worship. They boarded it up temporarily. You could go inside there and you could worship in the church. Maurice died in 1196, and he left a considerable sum of money in his will for the completion of the church. So I want you to look at this and realize that that sort of half-timbered section, that's the width of the actual nave, so that when I show you this picture, that's what we're looking at. That's what was ready to worship in just 19 years. In spite of its soaring verticality, and the ceiling does rise to 107 feet, it's not hard to miss that Notre-Dame is, as one author says, an exceptionally dark church. One reason may be the narrowness of this central space. The light from the high windows on the right there strikes the opposite wall on the left. It doesn't pool down to the floor of the cathedral because it's so narrow. So in spite of this soaring, so I said that. So it's rather narrow because of it's rather dark because of its narrowness. There is a second master mason who took over at this point. And he really was faced with the immediate problem, which was to try to add some more light to the nave of the church before he built it all the way to the front door, to the west facade. And he found that he could have bigger windows if he changed the supporting buttresses outside. And in changing it, he actually invented a radical external support. We're going to see some more pictures in a minute of flying buttresses that stretched further and higher up the exterior walls. And you can see, when you stand inside Notre Dame, you can see where they made the change. The yellow arrow points to the old bay completed before the flying buttresses. And the reason that round window that the arrow points to is kind of dark is because outside of it, there is a roof that is part of the buttress system, the old buttress system. You're not going to get any light through that. The second master mason then, and they weren't called architects, they were called master masons. With his flying buttress, he could alleviate that roof and make a bigger window. So in the next bay to the left of the yellow arrow, you see the new larger windows, and you can actually see light coming through them. So that was the whole point of doing that. Notre-Dame as a whole was not constructed within the confines, or it was constructed rather within the confines of an already crowded space on the Ile de la Cité. The arrow shows you the two towers of Notre-Dame there, and all those other buildings jammed on to the island. That's certainly not how we see it today. This is how we see it today. The Parvis, that's the name of the plaza in front of the church, and that's from the French word for paradise. The Parvis didn't exist at all in that size. In fact, throughout the Middle Ages, people would not have been able to see the entire facade the way that we do. They would be jammed up close in front of it and craning their necks way high to look. The historian Alan Timko wrote this passage about Notre-Dame and specifically about the western facade, and I'd like to read it to you because I just think it's quite beautiful. He said, Paris in the 13th century was one of the main stopping points in history, like Athens in the 5th century BC and Byzantium in the 6th century. Each city had a social and political lesson for the world. Each made the world a gift of architecture, the Parthenon, Hagia Sophia, and the western facade of Notre-Dame. For the 50 years the facade was being built, Paris maintained its maximum strength in art and politics. And then history wandered out on the road again to the Florence of Dante and Giotto and elsewhere. I just love that. Work on the facade began in 1200. The modern architect Le Corbusier called it the pure creation of the mind. He was fascinated with the facade and its carefully calculated dimensions. Le Corbusier took photographs and then he marked them with a ruler and a compass in lines and arcs to determine for himself the proportions that govern the facade. From the ground to the start of the towers, the facade is nearly a perfect square of 100 feet in each direction. And this is its fundamental source of calmness. The towers convert that square into a rectangle, exactly 1.5 times as high as it is broad. The dimensions preserve a sense of order as the wall lifts more than 200 feet in front of you. And as we look at the facade going forward, we're going to do some highlights of some of the sculpture. Keep in mind that when it was completed in 1250, much of the sculpture you're going to see was painted and gilded. So the 3 portals feature scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary. In the center, I'll show you a detail. The tympanum, the triangle part there over the doorway, and there's the razor wire. It's as close as you can get if you hold your, I didn't have a selfie stick, so you have to hold your camera up as high as you can to get a picture these days. In the center, in the tympanum, there is, the theme is the Last Judgment. So there's Christ in majesty coming back at the second coming. And just below him, squinch up your eyes, there's a winged figure, and that's the Archangel Michael. He's holding his scale since it's Judgment Day. And next to him, and he does look sort of devilish, the devilish is trying to tip the scale in, the devil's trying to tip the scale in his favor. He's got a finger and a foot on it to try to push it that way. And the far right side, we have the portal of Saint Anne, the story of the Virgin Mary's mother, and the tympanum features the Virgin and Christ enthroned. On her right, the blue arrow there is Bishop Maurice, the founder of the cathedral, and on her left, kneeling, is the king, King Louis VII. Both men were deceased by the time this tympanum was being put up, but they were being honored here for their devotion to the building of the cathedral. Now, just above the tympanum is a row of statues called the Gallery of the Kings. It was originally completed in about 1220. The row features 28 crowned kings. They're about 10 feet tall, and they're carved sort ingeniously so that if you were looking at them from below, they wouldn't be distorted. Their features would read naturally. They were depicting the human ancestors of Mary and Jesus, the branches of the Jesse tree. And as such, they are holding branches, leaves and branches in their hands. They're not holding scepters. But crowds below missed that clue to their and mistook them for representations of the kings of France through history. It was a mistake in identity that would cause a disaster in 1793. Now, the notion that cathedrals took several centuries to build is actually not as accurate as we think. Yes, work could continue, improvements, and they certainly do at Notre-Dame into the next centuries, but a typical cathedral was built in less than 100 years. Notre-Dame was up and running, finished in only 90 years, and some cathedrals went up in less than 50 years. The master builders had at their disposal some pretty modern tools, the winch, the windlass. Up on the top of this building here, you see the tread wheel, big enough for men to be in to power as a kind of, man-sized hamster wheels. And those items would sometimes be left in place. I have been to churches where there's still a tread wheel up in the tower because it was, they didn't want to dismantle it and take it down. There it was. Master builders were experts at rigors of block and tackle. And so they could handle stones pretty easily. So supply chain issues aside, they could get the work done. Now, in the mid 13th century, we finally learned the name. We finally have a name of the master mason who was in charge of things. His name was John de Chelles, and he started the job at Notre-Dame in 1257. He continues to work on those two issues, stability and lighting, and he takes advantage of modern technologies like any builder would. the old double flights of flying buttresses that the second Mason put in the 1180s are now replaced by these beautiful single arches, and you see them in this stunning black and white photo from 70 years ago, which leap in a narrow flight, the author said, which I thought was nice, from the outer piles to the upper reaches of the wall. It was during the mid-1300s that the north and south rose windows were created. The north window of the transepts. The north is darker. It features mostly blue lights, and it features scenes of the Old Testament. The southern rose features more red and bright colored lights and or glass, and it features scenes of the New Testament. The amazing colors of medieval stained glass come from various metals that have been added and then heated to create those beautiful colors that we're familiar with. Details were then painted on to the individual pieces of glass and reheated. Now, some folks would question, why go to all that trouble for scenes like this that are too far away to be seen by the naked eye? Why to go to all that trouble? Those are amazing pieces. Some author has suggested that maybe it was the colored light streaming through that rendered everything sacred that it touched, or maybe they were for God's eyes only. Medieval people associated colored light with their vision of what paradise would be. Much of the medieval stained glass, though, with its vivid colors, has been replaced. The 18th century didn't see colored light as special and holy. They saw bright, clear light as special and holy. And it was the Age of Enlightenment, literally, figuratively. So they actually tore out large areas of the medieval stained glass and replaced it with either clear or gray, grisaille colored stained glass like the one you see there. Over the centuries, the church then has suffered from neglect, vandalism, and some unsympathetic restorations like that, like destroying the glass. In 1793, during the French Revolution, the mobs put the ladders up to the front of the church. Nooses were attached to the necks of those 28 kings, and they were pulled down to the parvis below. Then people decapitated them. If the fall didn't do it, the people did. This was the same year that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lost their heads as well. There was a deep resentment towards the church because in the midst of terrible poverty and high taxes and food shortages that caused some of the revolution, the church was paying no tax. The king statues, because, they thought they were the kings of France, and they were unhappy about that as well. The king statues were lost until 1839, when 5 bodies were uncovered, being found used as the foundation for a building elsewhere in Paris. And then an awesome discovery in 1977, where some 300 pieces of sculpture were found, including 21 of the 28 heads of the kings. And again, remember, and it's very impossible to tell from these photos, but if you get really close to them in person, you can see some vestiges of paint, for instance, of the way they were painted. Well, so during the revolution, the church became the Temple of Reason. The church was also used as a wine warehouse and a grain warehouse. Well, along came Napoleon Bonaparte, who in 1801 worked out a deal with the Pope and restored Notre-Dame to be a cathedral again. And in 1804, he crowned himself emperor there and his wife empress. Now, Notre-Dame would always hold a special place in the hearts of the French, but as the 19th century progressed and modernity took hold of so many aspects of life, the old Gothic cathedral was unpopular and uncared for. In 1831, Victor Hugo wrote a novel that he named Notre-Dame de Paris. We know it by its English title, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And it brought attention to the dilapidated state of the church. The authorities hired an architect named Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc to refurbish Notre Dame. One of the most controversial decisions that Viollet-le-Duc made was to put back the spire. There had been one in the 13th century, but it was leaning and falling by the 18th century, and it was taken down. But Viollet-le-Duc wanted it back. So he designed a slender lead-covered oak spire that weighed 750 tons, and he put it right there in the crossing of the church on top. And it rises to a height, it used to rise to a height of nearly 300 feet. He also put 16 over life-size copper statues of saints along the edge leading up to the spire, the roof edges. 15 of them look out over Paris. The 16th looks up at the spire, and that's Doubting Thomas, but he has the face of Viollet-le-Duc. Happily, those statues were moved off of the roof of Notre-Dame just days before the 2019 fire, so they were saved. He also restored 60 freestanding statues on the facade, including the Gallery of the Kings. So when you see it now in those earlier pictures of the building where you saw galleries of the kings, those are Viollet-le-Duc's 19th century reproductions, and the real heads are in the museum. Here's a revealing quote about Viollet-le-Duc. He said, "To restore a building is not to maintain it, to repair it, or rebuild it. It is to restore it in a complete state that may never have existed at any given time." In other words, he gave himself a lot of carte blanche, a lot of leeway to rebuild Notre-Dame. And among the things he completely made up were the chimera figures, the grotesques, hybrid creatures, the half birds, half monsters. There are 54 of them on the edges of the building. And you can see the vampire there. He's one of the famous ones. These are not gargoyles. They are chimera, technically. But there are 13th century gargoyles on the building, and they were designed as rain spouts, and they really still work as rain spouts. These 19th century things that creations that Viollet-le-Duc put on are just decorations, or they're there for us to think about, which he might have liked. The 20th century brought war to the doorstep of Notre-Dame, seen here, all sandbagged to prevent damage. The Germans dropped bomb in the area, but it didn't do significant damage. During World War II, the Nazis occupied Paris for years. Hitler apparently ordered his commander to burn it down, but they didn't. The Germans lost control of the city, and obviously Notre-Dame was saved at that point. But before the fire, Notre-Dame was getting 12 to 13 million visitors a year. April 15, 2019, we watched in horror, heart-stopping horror, at what was happening at Notre-Dame. Renovation work had been ongoing since 2013 under the direction of Philippe Villeneuve. He is an architect specializing in historic monuments. They were preparing to work on the spire, so there was a massive framework of metal scaffolding sitting atop the roof. Was it faulty electrical wiring? Was it a discarded cigarette? We may never know conclusively what started the fire, but up there, among the 800-year-old wooden rafters, the forest as it's known, fire started. There are no firewalls or sprinkler systems in the attic up there. And you realize where you are. Those are the vaults below you. The ceiling is below you, and the roof is above you. Well, it was. An alarm went off in the security office. A guard was sent up to look. He was sent to the wrong area. Apparently, he tried to call back to the office to say, "I don't see any fire." He didn't get anyone on the phone. He had to go back downstairs. Then he was sent 300 steps up to another section, and there the fire was fully engulfed. 23 minutes had passed since the first alarm. The fire departments were on the scene in minutes. It took about 15 hours to get the fire completely under control. It burned the roof and the spire, crashing through the stone vaults of the ceiling and into the church and into the center of the nave below. The jagged wound torn in Notre-Dame's heart is how the holes are described. The fire left 3 different holes in the ceiling and a pile of charred timbers and broken stones on the floor about 4 feet high. But amazingly, much of the church was saved. You can even see the Pietà and the cross in the background, and that's the choir section back there. They formed a human chain and they rescued the art and the relics, including the crown of thorns and the 13th century tunic of Saint Louis. One conservator who arrived to help found them laid out on the grass like a big flea market, she said. The fire burned at temperatures estimated to be up to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. It melted the lead covering the roof, and it released toxic dust into the air. Now, once the roof was burned off, the next concern became the buttresses. Now there was no counter pressure to the force that they were putting on the walls. They could have pushed the walls inwards. So their force had to be balanced with a system of interior scaffolding and a system of these giant curved wooden braces, which were put under the flying buttresses on the exterior to keep their force in check. Just to be on the safe side, they used remote-controlled robots at first to remove debris from inside until they were sure that the structure above them was stable. It took 2 years to remove the twisted metal scaffolding, and that you see is pictured in the sort of bluish gray on top, and they literally had to go up there and pull it apart piece by piece. And now the restoration of the damaged vaults is continuing, with many technicians hanging 100 feet above the floor on ropes, like rappellers on some steep mountainside. Only 3 small panels of stained glass were destroyed by the falling spire. Some 25 of the uppermost windows, though, have been removed during reconstruction so that they're not damaged by accident. And you can see one here being restored, cleaned. The 14th century statue of the Virgin and Child, look at the scene on the right there in the pale blue arrow, as to where she was normally, right at the crossing. She and the child escaped dusty, but unharmed, being just a few feet away from the fallen debris. And she's been placed outside at a distance on the parvis and turned towards her church to watch the restoration. At the scene of the fire, President Macron declared that it would be rebuilt in 5 years. And then he seemed to suggest that maybe something new would take the place of the old wooden roof, lead-covered wooden roof and spire. And that suggestion led to a lot of creative submissions. There was this one, for instance, where the roof and the spire are made of glass. And this one, where they're also made of glass, but colored glass this time. And I'm kind of liking this one because it references the way the medieval roof had looked, which was covered in colored tiles. And then this submission, which I think they didn't take quite as seriously as the others, perhaps. I'm pretty sure we will never see something like that happen. The day after the fire, the president also tapped retired 5-star General Jean-Louis Georgelin to lead the process. The general and the architect have clashed publicly, but in the summer of 2020, everyone was in agreement on how it would be reconstructed. That is, in its, quote, last known state. That means it will look like it did when Viollet-le-Duc finished with his refurbishment 150 years ago. This suits the architect Villeneuve just fine, as he's a huge fan of Viollet-le-Duc. The spire will be a reconstruction of the 19th century one. And apparently the architect Villeneuve has a tattoo of it on his arm from his elbow down to his wrist. So he is truly dedicated. It's also been decided that they'll reconstruct the roof of timber the same way the one had and cover it with lead, just as it was before the fire. The wood for the roof is coming from donations from around France, and there's some pretty special trees. The largest and oldest ones were planted just before the French Revolution. Sawmills are being used to build the trusses, but they're going to be finished by hand using medieval tools. The lead that they'll put on will only be 1/8 of an inch thick, and they say there will be no danger to the public unless you go up there and lick it yourself. You'll be just fine. There'll also be new fireproofing and fire suppression systems installed, and we should be seeing the spire going up pretty soon, I think, if they're going to stay on schedule. So far, the process is costing about $865 million was one quote, but donations flooded in from around the world. And in the first 2 days alone, they reached $1 billion. So they've got plenty of money to work on it. They're also doing some long overdue cleaning. They're using a variety of techniques to clean decades of soot and grime off the surfaces, as well as smoke and dust from the fire. They're trying a latex product that they paint on and then peel off. So the walls inside may be very, very white when they're done. The great pipe organ, which sits just inside the western facade, you come in the door, it's behind you overhead. It's the largest such instrument in France, and this one was installed there in 1733. Most of the pipes, most of the 8,000 pipes were fine, but the base holding them had to be restored. So that's being worked on right now as we speak. Notre-Dame was the first masterpiece of new French architecture, and it features the hallmarks of a new style we call Gothic: skeletal construction of pointed arches, flying buttresses, and thin stone pillars, creating great height, lots of room for stained glass, and elaborate sculptural programs. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Notre-Dame was built by group effort, which the entire community took part in: the manual laborers, as well as the master artists, the merchants, corporations, common people, and kings. Now that process is being repeated in the 21st century, and surprisingly soon, we may be able to explore the cathedral again in person for ourselves. To be able to look down on the parvis from the heights and imagine all the worshipers and pilgrims and tourists who've gathered on this spot for more than 2,000 years and marvel at it all. Thank you very much. And I'll take your questions or comments if you have any. I'll do my best. Thank you.
So Mary, wonderful job as always. And yes, let's take at least 10 minutes of questions here. So if you have any questions, folks, you can type them into the Q&A. If you have any comments, you can type them into the chat. Donnie asks, where are the original king statues and heads kept today? Are they on exhibit?
Yes, they are on exhibit at the Cluny Museum, or known as the Museum of the Middle Ages, Moyen Age. I've put, wait, let me see if my list of, it's on the list of references that Robert will send you, their website. What's interesting is the Cluny Museum is also the remains of one of the Roman baths. And so it's a fabulous museum that has enormous Roman ruins right on the left bank of Paris. And inside it has all of the sculptures that they have found from Notre-Dame and the heads.
Judy asks, how will the acoustics change with the rebuild?
Oh, I assume that they'll be quite similar. As I said, they're going to rebuild it in its last known state. So the organ will be back. The roofs will be the same height as they were before. They're using the same kind of materials as they had done, as Viollet-le-Duc had done, and the medieval builders. So I imagine it will be quite similar. But because of the cleaning, and this is causing a little controversy, it may look shiny and bright and white inside, and it probably won't look 800 years old anymore.
Marcia asks, can tourists enter any part of Notre-Dame now, or is it totally closed?
It's totally closed, except for in the mid-60s, out there on the parvis, If I can go back, we'll see how talented I am. Okay. In the mid-60s, they, you see one of those glassy blocks over there has a staircase going down. They open an archaeology museum, and you can see portions of the crypt and things. So my understanding, you can see underneath that area. They have reopened that now that they've stabilized the building. But no, you're not going, public is not going in yet. Macron has set the opening has been set for December of 2024. So we have a year and a half to wait.
An anonymous attendee asks, where is the crown of thorns kept for now? Is it on display?
It is, as a matter of fact, on Notre-Dame's website. I was just looking today. It's on view for pilgrims to see at another Parisian church right now during Lent. So good question. You can see it if you get to Paris and you go to this other church. I wouldn't want to quote the name off, but you can look it up by going to Notre-Dame's own website, and it shows you what you can do for Lent, and you can go see the Crown of Thorns. Yeah.
Florence asks, the cathedral at Saint Denis near Paris had many kings and queens.
Absolutely.
When did it change to Paris?
Well, you know, interestingly, throughout history, you're absolutely right. The kings and queens chose to be buried at Saint-Denis. They chose often to be crowned at Reims Cathedral, so not in Paris, but nearby, and buried at Saint-Denis. It predates in our Notre-Dame here. And so it's just been the tradition. You're absolutely right. It is the place where almost entirely the kings and queens of France have been buried, not Notre-Dame.
Lois asks, when do you expect it to be back open to the public?
December 2024 is what they're saying. And you know, when Macron made the statement that it'll be open in 5 years, the belief was that they would try to have it open for the Summer Olympics in 2024. But they're now saying publicly that they're looking at December. I should say, there have been services there. There have been some private, you know, very small services that have taken place inside Notre-Dame since the fire, but it's not going to be open to the public until December of 2024. That's their latest.
Margaret says this was fascinating and so very informative. Mercy.
Thank you.
Francis says fantastic, thank you. Patricia says amazingly informative. I sincerely thank you. Sally says what a wonderful overview of the history and the work in progress. Anita says wonderful presentation. Maddie says marvelous. Deborah says wonderful. Deborah visited Notre-Dame back in 2018.
Good.
Dory says excellent presentation. Let's see here. Roland says what a wonderful recap of the history of the site and the building of Notre-Dame.
Oh, thank you.
Dawn says utterly fascinating. Americans can't begin to grasp a history this old.
No. And you know, as we look out on the Parvis here, I just want to point out, and the reason I chose this photo, because I was lucky enough to be there this past September. This is not a picture from then, obviously, but what you don't realize, because you're still walking up to it like sort of dumbstruck, even though there are big construction fences and razor wire across the front, you still, you know, can see most of it above the doorway level. But these light markings that you see on the Parvis represent the old medieval streets, and way up there in the right where there is an apse. Those are some, when I kept saying earlier that some of the remains of the Merovingian church were found in front of Notre-Dame, or the Roman Basilica, or the Carolingian church, they've picked out some of those things on that plaza that you can look at yourself and sort of gauge. So as I said, we don't experience it the way that medieval people would have, but the people in the planning, you know, who've done this have try to acknowledge that in the past it was a very different way to look at Notre-Dame. But but yeah, hopefully we'll all be back in soon. I think it's going swimmingly, to tell you the truth. I think it's 24 hours a day. They really are working. About 1,000 people are on the site every day, and they really, truly are working 24 hours a day on it.
KC says, thank you for clearing up my belief that construction of cathedrals took hundreds of years. This has been a very informative lecture. Anne says it's been a fabulous presentation. Martha says this was fantastic and she can't wait to return to Notre-Dame. Frank says, bravo, great presentation with a sweeping historical overview and survey of the modern conservation and reconstruction efforts. Amy says, amazing. I was there in 2008, but was not able to go inside. I'm looking forward to maybe going back and finally seeing the inside.
Absolutely.
Julie says, this makes me sentimental, having been there in 2017 and having pictures taken in the wooded area above.
Oh, yes. Oh, wow. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I threw in some of my old photos from 30 years ago. Some of the grainy, terrible, out of focus photos were mine from years ago. Saint-Denis, if you do go to Paris, try to take some time to go to Saint-Denis. It's people describe it as a terribly depressed, industrial looking suburb of Paris, and it is, but you can take the metro straight out there, and the church is miraculous inside and outside, but mostly inside. So it's something to see if you'd like to see more of Paris. But thank you all for joining it today.
Yeah, Barb says, brava. Joanne says, it brings back wonderful memories, as well as the horror of that day, even though I only watched on TV. And the final question goes to Joanne, who says, great job as always. And she wants to know when Martha's next presentation is. Well, I have good news and I have bad news, all right? The bad news is Martha will not be with us in April. I think Martha might be doing some traveling or whatnot. But I have booked Martha twice in May. So we're gonna Mary, right. I'm saying Martha, but I mean Mary.
There you go. Okay.
Sorry, Mary.
Well, it's very religious, Martha, Mary. I figured we were talking about, yes, I am twice in May. You're right.
Now, there's a Martha involved in this as well. But Mary, I have booked Mary twice for May. And Mary, I'm gonna have to look this up. I probably am gonna screw this up.
I've got it right here.
What do you got, Mary?
I am appearing before you on Tuesday, May 2nd at 10:30 with a Zoom presentation about Newport, Rhode Island and those fabulous little cottages. And then again on Thursday, May 11th at 10:30, we're going to have a look at Greek art, a sort of survey, a romp, if you will, through the history of Greek art, but specifically, we're going to look at the rather new installation of Greek art at the MFA in Boston.
Yes, excellent, Mary. Looking forward to both of those. I'll have that information in subsequent emails for all of you. We'll miss you in April, Mary, but we'll get sick of you in May when we see you.
And if I don't have April to work on it, you won't have anything in May. So.
There you go, exactly. All right, well, thank you all so much. Look for an email from me in a couple of hours with this recording, with the feedback survey, with the reference sheet that Mary sent me, and information about the April art history programs. Right. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks so much, Mary.
Bye-bye.